Good afternoon. On behalf of the Nissley family and Cedar Lane Unitarian Universalist Church, I welcome all of you to this service of remembrance and celebration of the life of Connie Nissley. After today's service, there will be a memorial reception in the lounge where the family will greet you, where we can continue to remember Connie and all that she meant to us. In respect for our time together, I now request that you place all cell phones and other electronic devices on worship mode. If this is your first time in a Unitarian Universalist congregation, we want you to know that we're part of the congregational heritage of Protestant Christian churches, but that more than a century ago, we decided that we would rather build our religious community on the promises we make about how we respect and treat one another, rather than on uniformity or conformity of belief. As a non-creedal religious community, we honor religious wisdom and truth wherever we find it, in the great religious and spiritual traditions of the world, in nature, and in our own hearts. And when we grieve, we use our memorial services as occasions to celebrate the life of our loved one, rather than as an occasion for a proclamation of faith or proselytizing. We believe, as Unitarian Universalists, in life before death, and in living this life as fully and well as possible. We honor the fact that each of us here has brought our own spiritual understanding of the mysteries of life and death, and will find consolation in those understandings as we work our way through loss. We know very well that death is an inevitable part of our lives. We know as we learn to love one another that eventually our love will include loss and grief. Because no matter how fortunate we are in our lives, no matter how long we live, saying goodbye will come to each of us. But all of our knowing doesn't make it any easier. The final farewells always come as a loss for which we somehow feel ourselves unprepared. And so, we are here in this sanctuary of simple beauty and serenity to lift up the days of a beloved friend and spiritual companion, Connie Nissley, celebrating her full life. We gather her to our enduring memories and to remember her days among us with care, with gladness, and the deep love that will not let us go. It is always difficult to say goodbye to a beloved wife, mother, grandmother, a colleague, friend, and longtime beloved member of our church community. Connie and her husband Peter were longtime members of Cedar Lane, deeply involved in the life and the ministry of this church, and generous supporters of this community for many years. It is therefore fitting that we are gathered in this place, their spiritual home, to celebrate and honor Connie's life and her legacy of love. So this afternoon, through words and stories, music and song, we will weave together the life of Connie Nissley, knowing that the fullness of her life cannot be captured fully in an hour, though we will try. And in doing so, we celebrate the life that she lived, the loves that she cherished, the values that she stood for, the causes that she supported, and the communities that she helped build. In this way, we hope to inspire each one of us to do the same. But this afternoon, we share one thing in common. Connie's life has been woven into each of our own lives in so many ways. Our experiences of her now transformed into memories afloat on a sea of great love. And so we turn aside our accustomed ways and turn our faces again toward the face of the one whose life we remember, cherish, and celebrate today with gratitude and love. Welcome. We open our sacred time with the lighting of the chalice. The chalice flame is an ancient symbol of transformation, and the chalice that holds it is a symbol of the spirit of life and love that Connie embodied. So I now invite Tom and Eleanor to kindle the chalice in their mother's memory and invite us to rise in body or in spirit to speak in unison the chalice lighting words in your order of service. We gather this hour as people of faith with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in loving memory of our friend and spiritual companion, Connie Nissley, and in celebration of the life we share together. Please remain as you are as we sing hymn number 16, "'Tis a Gift to be Simple" in the gray hymnal. We're going to sing it through twice.
Hello, everybody. I have a poem to read that I think you'll understand felt like it was written for my mom, but before, the other thing I love about it is how we found it when we were looking for something that would be appropriate for today. My sister, Eleanor, came across a review in the New Yorker by Stephanie Burt, who the Green Acres teachers among us will remember as probably one of the most memorable students in the history of the school. Certainly the one I heard the most about. Stephanie was Stephen as a child and was a math genius, and then went off to Harvard and found poetry, and now is one of our country's best poets and poetry critics. And he was writing about Mary Oliver, and I think called her the unofficial bard of the Unitarian Universalist Church, among other things. So even more appropriate. So the poem is "The Messenger." My work is loving the world. Here the sunflowers, there the hummingbird, equal seekers of sweetness. Here the quickening yeast, there the blue plums. Here the clam, deep in the speckled sand. Are my boots old? Is my coat torn? Am I no longer young and still not half perfect? Let me keep my mind on what matters, which is my work, which is mostly standing still and learning to be astonished. the phoebe, the delphinium, the sheep in the pasture, and the pasture, which is mostly rejoicing, since all ingredients are here, which is gratitude to be given a mind and a heart and these body clothes, a mouth with which to give shouts of joy to the moth and the wren, to the sleepy dug-up clam, telling them all over and over how it is that we live forever.
Hello, I am Alex, Eleanor's husband. On the occasion of Connie's 80th birthday, Tom, who was just up here, wrote a series of ditties, and then Eleanor illustrated them and then letterpressed them into a booklet to give to Connie for her birthday. And the second edition is with us today. And so those of you who did not notice, there are some available in the back. It is a limited run, so watch out for that. Each ditty is a tribute to Connie's enthusiasm for the outdoors and the natural world, and to some extent also the fact that her children were often front row witnesses to that enthusiasm. And it's clear to me that Connie was someone who wasn't afraid to bring her work home with her, and sometimes put it in a bag in the freezer. So with that in mind, I'm going to read 3 of these ditties to you now. The mealworm. It's not much of a meal, this squiggly beast. A worm burger requires a few dozen at least. But if your class keeps a lizard, or parrot, or fish, they'll be more than content with this protein-rich dish. And the worm's own meals, it's been recently shown that they can digest even raw styrofoam. The skate egg case. What's this on the sand, as black as a hearse? To some, it is known as a mermaid's purse. Laid by a skate, washed up empty on shore, the fishlet inside having swum out before. Can't tell a skate from a ray? Don't be embarrassed. A ray births live young, a skate's oviparous. And then I'll end with Tigger, which was Connie's camp counselor nickname, and sort of general nom de guerre in many circumstances. Tigger. The scouts who arrived at Camp Furnace Hills may have wondered if their counselor's name fit the bill. She may not have bounced as if she were Burston, or spoken of herself in the plural third person. And she had some details that most Tiggers lack, like Bermuda shorts and a braid down her back. But when she showed them the wonders of the woods, they'd surely be driven to sing that the wonderful thing about Tiggers is Tiggers are wonderful things.
Hello again. We had a small service for my mom about a month ago in Seattle, and I felt like one thing I had to do there was tell people about her. They didn't know her as well as you all do. So it's so wonderful to be here with people who knew my mom in kind of all the parts of her life, who knew me and my sister growing up. So thank you all for coming. I'm very glad to be back at Cedar Lane, and glad to be back in the sanctuary. I walked all around the building when we first got here, but for all the mornings I spent downstairs in Sunday school, my strongest memories are of this space, the beautiful windows, listening to Ken McLean's Christmas stories. Thank you for coming, Ken. To catch the latest update on Foggy Augie, if anybody remembers those. Running around backstage and sliding across the floor when there were no chairs when my mom was volunteering during the week. I felt like this was my place. And coming back to see old friends, listen to the choir, and feel the warmth of a candle in my hand when singing Silent Night at the midnight Christmas service. This was an important place for my parents and our families, one of the homes they made here, and I think one of the hardest places for them to leave when they moved out to Seattle 6 years ago. So I'm glad to be back here and to see so many of the people who knew my mother so well. As you can see in the program, a few of us will be sharing memories of her, including my sister Eleanor, her great friend here at Cedar Lane, Glennis Belay, and her fellow teacher at Green Acres, and a Cedar Lane member, Ann Fretz. But before those stories, I'll tell you a little about her life. Connie was the middle sister of the fabulous Lane girls of Mount Joy, Pennsylvania, a small town in the heart of Lancaster County. Their little brother Tom, who we also lost last year, was born 10 years later. As family legend has it, she met my dad in baby carriages. We have some pictures in the reception area running on a loop, and if you stick around, there's one of the two of them when they're about 2 years old at a party. So they knew each other their entire lives. My dad's father owned the funeral home in town. My mom's father ran the hardware store down the street, and their mothers, my grandmothers, knew each other well and discussed baby names over the card table. My mom was the valedictorian of the last class at Mount Joy High School in 1954, which I will note is the same year my dad's basketball team went to the state championship. And in the yearbook that year, there's a page that delighted my sister and I to no end when we were kids. It's the class will, in which each senior was supposed to bequeath to someone from this next class some quality of themselves. So it was determined that Connie Lane should pass on her braininess to Pete Nissley. And I think it worked. She went off to Mount Holyoke to study chemistry, which she continued to study in grad school at Penn. And then she began her life's work as a teacher of science at schools in Philadelphia and Baltimore, and then for about 3 decades at the Green Acres School in Rockville, Maryland, although I've recently found that's North Bethesda now. When my parents moved to Bethesda, they joined Cedar Lane, and she had careers too here as a volunteer and a soprano in the choir. She was a Girl Scout troop leader and camp counselor. As you've already learned, her camp name, Tigger. What you haven't learned is that it usually appeared in her online passwords, which in recent years became very helpful when we were helping her with her computer, although I should add that she didn't need much help with her computer. We got one of the very first PCs when they came out in 1980 or so. She taught herself BASIC. She balanced the checkbook on her computer. For years, probably until having kids got in the way, she sewed most of her own clothes, which she has passed on to her daughter and my wife. She loved puzzling out complicated problems. The most complicated of all was the Green Acres schedule, which she prepared by hand every spring. She was a volunteer also for all sorts of environmental causes, especially after she retired from teaching. She counted mayflies to assess water quality in Maryland streams, and she worked as a docent in the invertebrates exhibit at the National Zoo, and then, after she moved to Seattle, at the tide pool exhibit at the aquarium there, for as long as her Parkinson's would let her. One of my favorite lines from the cards that we've gotten from friends and family came from an old friend in upstate New York, the wife of one of my dad's college roommates, who said, "The last time I saw Connie," it's hard to read other people's words than your own. "The last time I saw Connie, she was standing on a tall platform at a huge aquarium, scooping out grub for a mammoth octopus at the Washington National Zoo. Only Connie." And even in her last days, as she was in a pretty dire condition at the hospital in Seattle, I was wearing a t-shirt with a fish on it, which is the kind of thing our family does. And to make conversation, I asked her if she could identify the fish. And with some effort, she said, "No, it's not an invertebrate." Only Mom. I think all of us agree, aside perhaps from standing in a church choir on Christmas Eve, she was happiest and most at home knee-deep in water, which you can see in both of the photos that we included in the program. Whether it was in a tide pool, or in the stream bed behind Green Acres, or in the mud flats at low tide at Chincoteague, or in Cape Cod Bay, she would ideally be examining a creature and explaining its form and function to anyone nearby. For almost my whole life, we spent a week in the summer on Cape Cod, on the bay side where the tide flows out twice a day and leaves a quarter mile of sandbars. And when the tide would go out, she was like a Pied Piper for all of us out there, even for non-naturalists like me, identifying animals, including the tiniest and least glamorous, and when she was still teaching, wondering if she could bring one home to live in her classroom. Her classroom at Green Acres was full of critters, and sometimes so was her house, including our freezer, as Alex has already mentioned, and you can find an excellent illustration in the Diddy book. Over time, I would learn that when I was digging through the deep freeze for a tub of chocolate ice cream, I might at any time also encounter, frozen in a plastic bag, the corpse of a bird. Maybe a hawk someone had found and brought to her because that's what you did, or a songbird that had flown into our window, which she was planning to bring into school to show off or even dissect. Which reminds me of the last time she got into trouble. For my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, we took a wonderful family trip to Alaska in one of those small cruise ships that kind of goes into the nooks and crannies of the Panhandle. There was a day hike on land, and some of us came across some unidentified bones in the brush. And not only did my mom identify the bones as a bald eagle's, she arranged them into a skeleton, and then brought them back onto the boat to show to my kids. That's the part that got her in trouble, because a bald eagle is a protected species. And the people on the boat were not happy. But there's a photo of her, which again is on the reel in the reception room, which is one of my favorites of her, sitting in the mud next to the skeleton, all properly arranged next to her on the ground. And she has about the biggest smile I've ever seen on her face, except maybe when she brought my sister home from the hospital. She didn't like breaking the rules, but she did make her own way. She was intrepid, whether it was baking an apple pie at our campsite, by building an oven in a whiskey box lined with tinfoil. Did you know you could do that? Or leading groups of teenagers on exchanges to Finland and Sweden and Denmark, which I can imagine doing, or lobbying at the Maryland State House for gay marriage in her 70s, or traveling also in her 70s to Transylvania on a Unitarian exchange, or just last year flying solo back to Pennsylvania despite her advanced Parkinson's to attend her 64th high school reunion, a trip we all were, in retrospect, glad she made. She was a caring and kind mother and grandmother. She had a goofy sense of humor, and a brightness in her eyes from mischief and happiness that would come out when you least expected it, even when she was most frustrated by her condition in the past few years. And as I think I've realized more and more as I've gotten older myself, she lived her life as she chose it, following her own passions and interests and her sense of the world and how it should be. There's another thing somebody once said about her that I've always remembered, although I don't think I ever told her. Once, when I was about 9 or 10, one of my friends, Tom Newby, for those of you who knew him, was over at our house, and he whispered to me, I can't remember what inspired it, maybe it was the time she was walking around with a tennis racket cover on her head, because why not? Your mom's weird. And I don't think he meant it as a criticism, although Tom was not weird. And I didn't take it that way, even then. I think he was a little in awe that she could let herself be her own person, and I think all of us who knew her still are. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Glenys Belay. I joined Cedar Lane in 1967 and the staff as the religious education administrator in 1970. Peter and Connie signed the membership book in November of 1971. Thomas was 3 and Eleanor a baby. The 70s was the era of big families. We had one family with 8 children and several with 7. We had 400 children registered in 2 sessions of the religious education program. Office equipment was black dial telephones, ditto and mimeograph machines requiring a lot of manual labor. We asked all parents to volunteer in some way to support the program and teachers. Connie chose to work in my office. Much of the volunteer office work is minutiae, but it is necessary and important to the success of a program as large and as diverse as Cedar Lane's. And Connie did it all. She collated, copied, stapled, alphabetized, and stuffed mailings. She cataloged, covered, and shelved books for the library. She mixed paints. She sorted magic markers, crayons, and chalk. She washed and shelved books. She shelved books for the library. She mixed paints. She even cut out paper flowers and made UUs into faces for spring bee signs. Initially, Connie came in several times a week, bringing Eleanor and Tom with her. Later, she was teaching at Green Acres. When she was teaching at Green Acres School, she came in late on Friday afternoons to assemble the materials for the teacher folders. And she continued to do that after I retired and until Peter and Connie moved to Seattle to be closer to family in 2013. She volunteered in the religious education office for 35 years. She served on the RE Council as treasurer. As the council liaison to the Board of Trustees, she was co-chair with Natalie Whistler. To thank parents who volunteered in the classrooms every Sunday morning during the year, Connie and Natalie organized the first teacher appreciation dinner with parents cooking and bringing the food. That time we ended up with a lot of pasta. But the teachers loved it, and we learned how to do it better. She taught RE classes and RE and Spring Bee classes in the natural sciences. For years, Peter and Connie were part of a Cedar Lane group which cooked dinners for Bethesda Kids once a month. Singing with the sopranos in the church choir was a highlight of her church week. She loved to sing. After I retired, she met weekly with Helen Strang and me to organize the church archives, and I valued their input. They had a different knowledge of the history of people and programs than I did. Connie, daughter, sister, loving wife to Peter, proud mother to Eleanor and Thomas, mother-in-law and involved grandmother to Peter and Henry, a mother-in-law to Alex and Laura, a homemaker, a scientist, and lover of the natural world and all living things. Connie attended a summer alumni choir week whenever she could. She was a gardener. Peter and Connie loved to cook. Peter would sometimes make pasta from scratch on Fridays. Connie always looked forward to going home for dinner on those nights. She was not into shopping. She made things. She did beautiful knitted handmade sweaters in complicated Fair Isle patterns. She knitted gloves and socks. She was one of the church quilters who together created a hand-built quilt each year to be raffled at the church auction. They also designed quilts for staff members when they retired. Connie and Hermit Dupre designed my church retirement quilt, assembled from patches created by church members. It has a pukeko, a New Zealand bird, which Connie designed at its center. Some months later, she gave me a pillow made of the same fabrics, using Ilse Fleshman's schematic design of the church and children. They are in the lounge this afternoon. She gave me my favorite wooden stirring spoon, which I believe was handmade and is now as well worn. Most of all, Connie enjoyed teaching and working with children. She loved to take them outside into the world and introduce them and share her knowledge of the birds, insects, plants, and animals living in their environment. I think this photo on the program cover is iconic, Connie. There she is, grinning with her whole being, and delighted to be on the beach. I like to think it is Cape Cod, where the extended family gathered every summer. Nothing faced Connie. Problems were not problems. They were puzzles to be figured out, which she enjoyed doing. In all the years we were together, I can't remember her ever being angry or upset. She enjoyed coping. The Whistler and Nissley families went camping together on one of our Spring Bee family weekends. It started to rain, in fact, to pour. Connie went outside to right the poles, which were probably being blown by the wind. With water pouring down her raincoat, she turned back to Natalie and said, "I love to cope." Connie's roots in Mount Joy's Mennonite community shaped her. She was invested and loyal to her family, to Cedar Lane, to Green Acres, to the Audubon Society, the choir, her classes, the quilting and knitting groups. She was down to earth, practical, curious and interested, kind, patient and calm, always accessible, fun, intelligent, authentic. She was a joy to work with. I loved her. Everyone loved her. She was easy to love. Gibran writes, "Work is love made visible. It is to build a house with affection. It is to sow seeds with tenderness and reap the harvest with joy. It is to charge all things you fashion with the breath of your own spirit." Connie did this with a big smile and a song in her heart. I was so fortunate that she stepped into my life. I miss her. Goodbye, Connie.
Good afternoon. I'm Ann Fretz, and it was my great privilege to have worked with Connie for many years at Green Acres School. I distinctly remember first meeting her back in 1984. Having just been hired to begin teaching in the fall of that year, I was invited to spend a day at Green Acres to meet teachers and visit classes, including Connie's science class. The science room was a delight to behold, with many large plants along the windowsill, rocks and fossils on the shelves, and animals galore in cages and aquariums. And also a perky rabbit named Shadow hopping freely about the room. What a paradise for budding scientists. And there was Connie with a long braid down her back, dressed simply in practical clothes, ready for indoor experiments or heading out on a nice day. Clearly, she was in her element with the young children seated on the floor in front of her as they discussed whatever emerged from their inquisitive minds. The conversation was open-ended, and no matter the question, whether it had to do with birds or rocks or the weather, she provided clear answers to most inquiries. And if she wasn't certain of the answer, she said she would look it up and get back to them at a later date, and I'm sure she did. I was impressed with the students' enthusiasm and their eagerness to engage with their teacher. Perhaps Connie loved best taking her classes to the creek behind the school, where she and the students would wade in the cold, murky water, looking for critters, rocks, and whatever else caught their attention. I had opportunities to go with her on creek walks when I was teaching science to third graders. She was easy to work with and willing to help with anything. I understand Connie was an enthusiastic participant in the annual 7th grade trip to Chincoteague, where she set off on bird walks at dawn with a number of future birders eagerly following. These were 7th graders heading out at dawn. And where she reveled in digging in the mudflats at low tide to find creatures hiding in the sand, thus imparting her passion for the ecology of the marsh and the seashore. Connie instilled in many of her students a lifelong interest in science and the natural world, and some of them eventually would go on to become professional scientists. What a tribute to a revered teacher. Connie was also an excellent seamstress, as you have already heard. Green Acres has a tradition of quilting, and each retiring teacher received a special quilt made by the staff. Typically, each person contributed a square to the quilt. Connie's squares were always exquisite birds, which she designed and fashioned by hand using a technique called paper piecing. Each bird could be easily identified as a cardinal, hawk, great blue heron, or other bird, and I marveled at her skill. Beyond Green Acres, Connie volunteered for the Audubon Naturalist Society, where she helped to monitor a local stream for water quality. I joined her team for several years before she moved to Seattle. 4 times a year, we'd go out to the creek with a couple of other volunteers to take samples of water and check them for tiny critters, hoping to see certain species that indicated that the water was in the healthy range. Connie would bring all the supplies: nets, a thermometer, a tape measure, many small dishes and vials for the water samples, magnifying glasses and a microscope, an invertebrate guidebook, and a small table to set up creekside. And of course, knee-high boots for wading in the water. And she helped us identify and record our findings that would then be added to a larger database back at Audubon. My favorite memory includes Peter. Connie and Peter invited my husband and me to go with them to Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania to view hawks soaring overhead at the height of the fall migration. It was a special experience sitting on the rocks atop the mountain, along with many other avid birders viewing hawks silently moving south as they had done for eons. As sunset approached, we left the mountain and set up tents in a small designated camping area. And Peter easily started the fire for the delicious stew he had made, and he seemed completely comfortable with all aspects of camping. I could tell he'd been a Boy Scout in his youth. And Connie served a wonderful apple pie for dessert. It was then that I learned she was a baker in addition to all her other talents. And so we bid farewell to Connie today. She was a beautiful human being who enriched the lives of all who knew her. I will miss her greatly, but her kind and generous spirit, her ever-present curiosity, and her zest for each day's experiences will remain with me forever.
Much like my mother, I like to talk a lot. And I can certainly talk a lot about Mom, but also like my mother, I do not like speaking in front of crowds. So I will try and keep this short. Mom and Dad joined Cedar Lane in the early 70s, apparently, 1971, when I was a baby. I grew up in this church and only knew my parents as Unitarians. But this was not given. 3 of my 4 grandparents were descended from plainclothed Pennsylvania Mennonites. And though my parents both grew up in Presbyterian churches. My mom's father, however, was from Massachusetts, and his father was, for a time, a Unitarian minister, but he gave it up because he was too shy. So when Mom and Dad moved back to Bethesda in the late 60s, Mom began shopping for a church. But what I really think she was shopping for was a choir. And thankfully, Cedar Lane had a fantastic choir. And had the Presbyterian church had a better choir, things might have turned out very differently. Mom went on to sing in that choir for 40 years and became a bedrock part of the church, volunteering every Friday with Glennis Belay, co-chairing the religious education with Natalie Whistler, baking Christmas cookies with Helen Rosenthal, making ice cream for the whole church at the end of Spring Bee, and sewing auction quilts with David Yano. Another world that opened up to us, to Mom and I, through Cedar Lane was CISV, Children's International Summer Villages, an organization based around international peace camps and exchange programs. We found out about CISV through fellow Cedar Laner, Etta Johnson. CISV was not part of Cedar Lane, but we had a lot of meetings here and events here. I went to camp in Detroit the summer of 1982, and soon thereafter, Mom became their treasurer, a position she kept officially and unofficially for a very long time. Mom was on staff for camps we hosted in the DC chapter, generously hosted summer exchange students, and ended up leading 3 different exchange programs herself, taking groups of teenagers to Finland, Denmark, and Sweden. Take a sip. Thanks. In addition to being Unitarians and Cedar Laners, another identifying characteristic of my parents is that they were Scouts. Both my mom and dad were serious Boy and Girl Scouts all the way through high school, and Mom continued being a Girl Scout camp counselor by the name of Tigger well into adulthood. It informed her teaching, and it informed her environmentalism. You could safely say that Mom was an environmentalist, but it wasn't at first a political act. It was the kind of environmentalism that is the product of being born during the Great Depression and being raised by thrifty naturalists. And aside, my mom's parents met when my grandmother and my great-aunt Eleanor, their graduate educations in biology intertwined. We believe they met at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in the late 1920s, and both got their master's in biology at Radcliffe. Mom recycled, reused, and composted well before those terms were household words. It was part of the practice of being a Girl Scout, leave only footprints. My mom was famous for reusing Christmas wrapping paper, It was understood that if you received a gift of Dippity Dye paper from the Cedar Lane Christmas Craft Day, you were to carefully remove the tape and set it aside for the next year. There were gifts under our tree in the 2000s that were wrapped in paper from the 1970s, I am sure. Mom and Dad's scout backgrounds manifested in our family through the quantity of camping we did. Every summer, we'd head out on a multi-week camping trip, exploring the far reaches of North America via car and tent. Everything from the Grand Canyon to Newfoundland, the Canadian Rockies to the Great Smoky Mountains. I loved those trips and appreciate the adventurousness they required more and more as I get older. At some point, after Tom and I moved away, Mom and Dad discovered a choir camp in New Hampshire that they returned to for many years, I believe, because it gave them an excuse to sleep on a platform tent in the woods. I'm going to repeat Glennis's story. One of the most indelible images I have of Mom is probably from the 70s and possibly occurred during a Cedar Lane family camping trip. I guess it did. Mom putting up a tent in the pouring rain, water pouring down her face, and her yelling joyfully, "I love to cope." In the past few years of Parkinson's made it very difficult for even Mom to cope. Her cramped hands meant that she had to give up, all of her fine craft work, baking her delicious pies and stollen, and even another of her great loves, making spreadsheets and doing taxes. In this past year, she was particularly limited, but even after she had to give up singing with the Horizon House Choir, they are called the OK Chorale, she continued to have an aide take her to the rehearsals so she could quietly be amongst the singing she so dearly loved. Thanks.
Thank you, members of the choir, for that beautiful musical tribute to Connie. At this time, we will have some open sharing. So if you have a memory or a story that you would like to share about Connie, I invite you to come forward to the pulpit, introduce yourself, and share briefly. Briefly. Not invoke the spirit of Connie, but share briefly the memory or story.
I'll get it out of the way. I'm Henry Sgrecci. It's my pleasure to serve as Director of Music here since 2008, when Connie was a stellar member of the choir. Last night, many here in the room observed this ensemble, among others, sing a rousing, vital version of How Can I Keep From Singing. Often people ask me, what do you do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? And they only see me on Sundays. You do nothing. And I say, no, I actually sit in front of the computer a lot, and I look for music that I think will suit our needs here, suit our skills, our people, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was on a YouTube channel that I came across a delightful version of How Can I Keep From Singing? And that is the one that I chose to purchase. It's what we sang last evening. When I first introduced it to the choir, I said, now this is a recording of the Mount Holyoke Choir, alumni choir. And Connie said, I sang in that. And I kind of forgot about that. But when I was putting together the program for last night, I shared that recording. I went back and found it, and I shared it with the choir. And as I looked closely at the still photo, I thought, there's Connie, second row. So go to YouTube, pull up the Mount Holyoke alumni choir singing Gwyneth Walker's How Can I Keep From Singing, and you'll see Connie as you hear her sing. So that's a very, very dear memory for me and for the choir as well. And I'll also say on a personal note, Connie and Peter were so generous. They invited my wife and I to join them at Arena Stage for a presentation of The Music Man. They had 2 tickets that they couldn't give away, so they gave them to me. And we were able to find tickets for our children as well. So it was a great night for us. So Connie and Peter, they were wonderful to us. Thank you.
This is a Mount Holyoke. I'm Mary Olch, and thank you. And I went to Mount Holyoke 2 years after Connie. I worked in the chem lab, so I knew Connie, and I'm probably the first one here to know who Connie was. Anybody else want to claim earlier than 1958? So I had to dig out my Mount Holyoke clothes. So I've got my Mount Holyoke scarf. I've got my choir jacket. People take that down the second trial, but not anymore. So I just thought I would show up and say, I'm so glad we've had this choir over the years. I married Peter Olch, who was the third bass, if you will. His voice was so low, he couldn't do middle C, but give him an octave or 2 below that, and he could bellow fourth. Ken and I were talking about that earlier. So here's to Connie and all the things we did at college, and all the things that she turned into later, and 25 years later, I rediscovered her when they were here and when I married Peter. So let's hear it for Connie and good memories.
All right.
And lots of good music.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liz Bullock, and I was one of Connie's students at Greenacre School. And I wanted to share a memory briefly. And first, to say that my parents were very supportive of learning about science and the environment and the natural world. And I had a very special experience when I came to visit Greenacres when I was in 3rd grade. My parents took me to this school that my sister had started going to. She was in 5th grade. and you drive up and you feel like you're getting lost in the woods. And the only memory that I have from that day visiting that's my own, that wasn't a story that my parents told me later, was visiting third grade science class. And I was lucky enough to visit on the day when we were dissecting a fish. And I realize now later how great it was that Connie was able to make us feel like we were lucky to be dissecting a fish, because most of people's opinions of that in the room was how gross that was. And I remember being very excited. This very first day, I had no idea this was something you could do in science. I thought this was something you learned about. Maybe on paper, there would be a drawing of a fish instead. So it was kind of quiet in the room when Connie asked for volunteers. Would anybody like to, make this first incision? And everybody was really strangely quiet, and those of you who know me know, obviously, I don't stay very quiet for very long. And so I volunteered right away, this visitor, first person who had never been there, and she made me feel welcome, and I participated in the dissection, and the first thing I said when I came home was like, we got to dissect a fish. The other thing I remember is that there were animals there. And you could go visit the animals, and even if they weren't part of the science lesson that day, you could go at recess, you could go at lunch, and Connie would tell you all about them. You could visit the animals. So fast forward a little bit, I ended up going to Green Acres School in Rockville. Check it out, it's amazing. And she was also my 7th grade science teacher. Later, I was lucky enough to go on the Chincoteague trip with her. And my father, my sister, they went on Chincoteague with her as well. It's a family community place. And something I never got to tell Connie later was that I became a science teacher. She knew that I was a science teacher at Green Acres, and now I'm a science teacher for 7th and 8th grade. And in my classroom, in the lab, we've got turtles, we've got snakes, we have a bunch of rainbow trout. It's like a nursery program. And I know that Connie was a huge inspiration for me. And I wanted to say thank you to her family, because I know that for us to feel like she was a part of our family, we were borrowing her for a while, so thank you. And I know also that there's hundreds of us who have had this experience with her. It's not necessarily unique to me, but it felt unique and it felt special for me from her. And I have a poem that makes me think of her, because, naturalist poetry is something I, appreciate because of her. And it made me think about how everything could be something to be curious about, and everything could be explored, and if you waited long enough, and if you were quiet, and if you listened, you could find awe and inspiration somewhere, even in a place where most people don't find that. So excuse me, I'm in my 30s, I'm using my phone. I didn't memorize it. I'm sorry, but the ringer is off. So the poem's called No One Clapped by Marcy Hans, and it's fueled by 1,000,000 man-made wings of fire. The rocket tore a tunnel through the sky, and everybody cheered. Fueled only by a thought from God, the seedling urged its way through the thickness of black as it pierced the heavy ceiling of the soil, and it launched itself up into outer space, and no one even clapped. Thanks. Made me feel like Connie would totally clap for that seedling. Thank you.
We have time for one more, yes.
Hi, my name is David Clark. I'm a lifelong friend of Tom's. I would describe Mrs. Nissley, and forgive me for not calling her Connie. I grew up at a time when we called parents Mr. and Mrs., so I know her only basically as Mrs. Nissley. She was one of the second moms. We had a small, relatively tight-knit group of friends, and all the parents knew each other, and Mrs. Nissley was one of those parents and very important to me. And then when I was listening to those reflections and Tom's remembrance, I was thinking, what of these things resonates? And pretty much all of it, the naturalist, the teacher, the craftsperson, but Tom and a couple other people use the word kind. And the way I think I would describe Mrs. Nissley is she had a gravitas of kindness, and that's very important to kids. The kids are really tuned into that kindness. And so growing up, obviously your parents are important adults to you, but other adults are very important as well. And I think creating this atmosphere of kindness is important. And I think that, in a way, Mrs. Nissley was the fulcrum of that group's kindness. She was a very calm person, very caring person. I did spend a lot of time at Tom's house and Eleanor's house. And it was a second home. Spent many times in Cape Cod with them, and cherished memory of walking out at low tide. So I guess I just want to say to the Nissley family that I love you guys, and I loved your mom very much, and the world was a much better place, and my life was a much better life because of her. So.
Thank you for all the wonderful memories and reflections you have offered about Connie. The 20th century American philosopher George Santayana wrote, "To see things under the form of eternity is to see them in their historic and moral truth, not as they seemed when they passed, but as they remain when they are over. When a person's life is over, it remains true that she was one sort of person and not another. In the infinite mosaic of history, that bit has its unfading color and its perpetual function and effect. A person who understands herself under the form of eternity knows the quality that eternally belongs to her and knows that she cannot wholly die, even if she would. For when the movement of her life is over, the truth of her life remains. The fact of her is a part forever of the infinite context of facts." What is the truth of Connie's life that remains? Well, we have heard what are the several truths of her life. The truth of family, her deep love for her family, for her beloved husband Peter, being a caring and kind mother and grandmother. Now she and Peter, as we heard, met at birth. They went to the same schools. They were married for 56 years. And there's the truth of her commitment to education, to science, working for the Green Acres School as a teacher for many years, and inculcating a lifelong interest and passion in science and in the world, paving the way for others to follow. There's the truth of her intellectual keenness, valedictorian of her class in high school, the degree in chemistry, a lifelong learner who had a holy curiosity about life and the world. Then there's the truth of her passion for environmental justice and women's rights and GLBT rights and her political activism. There's the truth of her welcoming and hospitable spirit. She loved people. She loved talking to them. She loved getting to know them. She loved talking to them. She loved engaging them. She loved talking to them. There's the truth of her sense of humor and her quirky ways. She was weird. There's the truth of her love of nature. She was a naturalist who found the divine in nature and in caring for creation. And then there is her lifelong love of music and singing. Her singing in the Cedar Lane Choir for many years. There's the truth of her love for this faith and this church. As we heard, she was very involved in religious education, volunteering for 35 years, teaching religious education and Spring Bee and baking cookies for over 40 years on Craft Day. And then there's the truth of her zest for life, a strong commitment to life, choosing to live a life of joy, creativity, curiosity, service, and love. So, as I heard you share more about Connie, two readings came to mind that I just want to lift up because to me they really capture Connie. One is from the Irish dramatist and critic George Bernard Shaw, who wrote, "This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I'm of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die. For the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is a sort of a splendid torch which I have got hold for the moment, and I want to make it burn so brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations." And the next one, your reflection reminded me. This is from a colleague, the Reverend Art Severance. "Seek ye immortality. Live life then as if love and the good were its own reward, as if there were no heaven or hell, as if we mattered to the world, as if it was up to you to help others, as if the universe depended on you, as if you die tomorrow and your life will be so full that those who have loved you, will be your immortality. And you will live on long past the tomorrow of death. Seek ye immortality? Love life, and life will love you. Live life then as if you would never die." Connie was richer in things, keener in thoughts, generous in heart and hands, kinder in deeds, collaborative in work, courageous in action, more abundant in those qualities of sister, daughter, wife, mother, aunt, companion, friend, colleague, co-religionist, activist, that brought more love, beauty, and hope to this broken and beautiful world. Though we shall miss her, our grief is soothed by the richness of our living memories and her enduring presence in those she touched. So let us turn inward now in the spirit of prayer and reflection with gratitude and thanksgiving. Eternal Spirit of life, who some call God and others do not name at all, fall afresh on us today as we celebrate the life and mourn the loss of our dear departed friend and family member, Connie Nissley. Help us to recall that we come into this world in mystery and we go away the same. We give thanks for every gift of life that brings us joy, peace, and strength of heart. We give thanks For every person whose life speaks to us words of hope and affirmation, we give thanks, especially for Connie, in whose memory we gather today. We give thanks for her life, each of us recalling what she has meant to us. We give thanks for her love, thus centered the love of her family for many years. We give thanks for the lessons gentle and challenging Connie left with us, and grateful for the example her life was to the world. Bless, encourage, and strengthen those of us who are grieving today, and especially Peter, Eleanor, and Tom and their families. Keep them open to feeling the love that remains for them, ever renewing in the world. In their grief, O Spirit, help them to remember always the gifts and cherish the memory that came from knowing and loving Connie. Give us strength, O Spirit of love, to feel the blessings of connection which goes deeper than any human knowing, and hope enough to honor the gifts of life, even in the midst of death. Remind us of the things Connie lived for and cherished most, that we may carry on her legacy with commitment and joy. Turn our eyes and hearts again to the world of the living, to the needs of those we love, to the work we are called to do, and to a strong faith for the remainder of our years. Help us fashion a tapestry, a quilt of praise to the goodness of life, that our love for Connie may be witnessed, renewed, and strengthened in our love for others and for life itself. In the name of all that is holy and life-affirming, we say, Amen. Please rise and body or in spirit to sing Morning Has Broken, number 38 in the Gray Hymnal. Today is a closing and an opening, a saying goodbye and a saying hello again. So while we say farewell to the Connie we knew, we greet the Connie who has become a part of us, the Connie who lives on with us as the love which is in our hearts. Connie, your life we honor, your departure we accept, your memory we cherish. Rest now. At the end of your years with us, your part is played. Rest in the hearts and the minds of those who love you. Go in peace. Go in love. Go held in the embrace of the deep and abiding mystery of which we are a part. May it be so. Please be seated for the postlude.